Hello and welcome to this week's weekly presentation. The paper we chose is Lessons Learned from 3 Decades of Experience with Cap-and-Trade. At the early days of limiting pollution, virtually all pollution regulations took more of a command and control approach, either specifying the type of pollution control equipment to be installed or by setting uniform limits on emission levels or rates. Today, it is broadly acknowledged that because emission reduction costs often vary greatly, aggregate abatement costs under command and control approach can be much higher than they need to be. So the government introduced cap-and-trade system. So what is a cap-and-trade system? To put it short, it establishes a price on emissions either directly through taxes or indirectly through a market for tradable emission rights, called permits. A market-based approach tends to equate marginal abatement costs rather than emission levels rates across sources, and thereby it can, in principle, achieve pollution control targets at minimum cost. Since cap-and-trade system is a brand new idea in the 1980s, many environmental advocates felt this approach inappropriately legitimizing environmental degradation, while others doubt its workability. This paper examines 7 trading systems that have been implemented in the past and are well documented. The first system introduced in this paper is the leaded gasoline phase down. The original intention is that the lead oxide emission will corrode the catalytic converter, which were required in the new US cars starting in 1975 to reduce the emission of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. Unlike a textbook cap-and-trade system, there was no explicit allocation of permits. Rather, the system implicitly awarded property rights on the basis of historical levels of gasoline production. If a refiner produces gasoline with a lower total lead content than was allowed, it earned lead credits that EPA allowed it to sell. Under banking provisions of the program, lead credits could be saved for later use, providing an incentive for early reduction to help meet the lower limits that existed during the later years of the phase-down. All the firms made extensive use of this option. So the trading resulted in leaded gasoline being removed from the market faster than anticipated. In each year of the program, more than 60% of the lead added to gasoline was associated with traded lead credits. The high level of trading between firms far surpassed the level observed in earlier environmental offset markets. EPA estimated savings from the lead trading program of approximately 20% compared with alternative approaches that did not provide for trade. Because there is no requirement for a government approval for individual trades, the transaction costs in such a system could be small enough to permit substantial trade. The second program is the sulfur dioxide allowance trading. During the 1980s, there was growing concern that acid precipitation, due mainly to the emissions of sulfur dioxide from coal-fired power plants, was damaging forest and aquatic ecosystem. The legislation was proposing a one-size-fits-all command and control method that didn't receive much support. The government then gave power plants permits to emit, denominated in tons of SO2 emissions. Allocations were based on mainly the actual fuel used during the period from 1985 to 1987. If annual emission at the regulated facility exceeded the allowance allocated to the facility, the owner could buy allowance or reduce emissions, whether by installing pollution control, changing the mix of fuels, or scaling back the operations. If emissions at the regulated facility were reduced below its allowance allocation, the facility owner could sell the extra allowances or bank them for future use. The program performed exponentially well along all relevant dimensions. SO2 emissions from electricity power plants decreased 36% between the 1990s and 2004, even though electricity generation from coal-fired power plants increased 25% over the same period. By applying a $2,000 per ton statutory fine, the compliance was nearly 100%. Some worried that the emission would end up producing local hotspots of high concentration of SO2 in eastern forests. However, the geometric pattern of emission reduction was broadly consistent with model predictions, and the program did not generate significant hotspots. When it comes to cost savings, there was at least a 15% and perhaps as great as 90% of the cost of various counterfactual command and control policies. From the first two examinations, we can conclude the following results. So first, to provide some degree of certainty to regulated entities, facilitate their planning, and limit price volatility in the early years, it is valuable to put final rules in place well before the beginning of the first compliance period. This was done 2 years prior with the SO2 allowance trading program. Second, as with the lead trading program, the absence of requirements for prior approval of trades reduced uncertainty for utilities and administrative costs for government, and it contributed to low transaction costs and substantial trading. Third, as in the lead trading program, banking was extremely important. It accounted for more than half of the program's cost savings. Fourth, intra-sector emissions leakage can be minimized, as it was in this program by including all non-trivial resources within the sector. Fifth, high levels of compliance can be ensured through accurate emission monitoring with significant penalties.
Hello. Another example of CapandTrade is the Regional Clean Air Incentives Market. South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is responsible for controlling emissions in the four-country area of Southern California, launched its Regional Clean Air Incentives Market, which is called RECLAIM, in 1993 to reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides, and in 1994 to reduce SO2 emissions from 350 affected sources. It is including power plants and industrial sources in the Los Angeles area that emitted 4 or more tons per year of either pollutant. RECLAIM replaced command and control regulations that were scheduled to bring the region into compliance with national ambient air quality standards. The NOx and SO2 caps declined annually by 8.3% and 6.8% respectively until 2003. By June 1996, 353 program participants had traded more than 100,000 tons of NOx and SO2 credits with a value of over $10 million. Virtual perspective imperial evidence indicates that emissions at RECLAIM facilities were some 20% lower than at facilities that were regulated with parallel. Command and control regulations at hot source did not appear, and that substantial cost savings were achieved. So from Regional Clean Air Incentive Market, we can see that, first, because the RECLAIM system included Q zones, which trades allowed in only one direction to account for prevailing winds, the design demonstrated the feasibility of a basic ambient as opposed to an emission-based CapandTrade system. Second, over allocation of allowances means there's no scarcity created and therefore no functioning spot allowance market, though there were active forward markets throughout. Two programs are relevant here. First, under EPA guidance and enabled by the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, 11 northeastern states and the District of Columbia developed and implemented the nitric oxide budget program, a regional nitric oxide cap-and-trade system in 1999. It reflects the significant adverse health effects of ground-level ozone. The goal was to reduce summertime ground-level ozone by more than 50% as compared with 1990 levels. All affected states adopted the model rule. As in the earlier program, states were given allowance to allocate to in-state sources. In 2099, the nitric oxide budget trading program was effectively replaced by the Clean Air Interstates Rule, and CAIR was replaced in January 2015 by the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. From these examples, we can see first, unnecessary price volatility can be avoided if the design of the emissions trading program is clear, with all rules in place well before the program takes effect. Second, this history provides a precedent and model of expanding the coverage of a cap-and-trade system over time to include additional jurisdictions, such as neighbor states. And third, giving states freedom to allocate allowances among in-state sources can provide valuable flexibility without compromising environmental goals. In 2006, California enacted Assembly Bill 32, which is called AB 32, which required the California Air Resources Board to establish a program to cut the state's greenhouse gas emissions to their 1990 level by the year 2020. The program includes energy efficiency standards for vehicles, buildings, and appliances, renewable portfolio standards that increase the share of renewable electricity supply from 20% to 33%, a low-carbon fuel standard that requires refineries to reduce the carbon content of motor vehicle fuels, and a cap-and-trade system. The AB32 cap-and-trade system began in 2013 with coverage of electricity sold in California and large-scale manufacturing. Most allowances were initially distributed via free allocation, with greater use of options over time. Banking is allowed, and regulated entities may use approved offsets from emissions reductions from forestry, direct digestion, and ozone-depleting substances reduction to account for up to 49% of reductions. A ceiling on allowance prices is established by releasing allowances from a reserve when auction prices hit specified levels that is calculated over time. A price floor is created through an auction reservation price, with unsold allowances held until the reservation price exceeded for 6 consecutive months. This combination produced an effective price collar, making the system a hybrid of cap-and-trade and carbon tax. So, what can we learn from the California system? First, it has demonstrated that initial free allowances allocation that fosters political support can be successfully transitioned over time to greater auctioning of allowances. Second, California experience is a reminder of the political pressures to use auction revenues for purposes other than reducing distortionary taxes. So in May 2015, the AB32 cap-and-trade auctions had generated over $2 billion, in a month that is anticipated to reach nearly $4 billion by the end of 2016. Third, California's AB32 system was the first carbon dioxide cap-and-trade system to be essentially economy-wide, demonstrating the feasibility of this approach, compared with less efficient approaches that treat different sectors differently. And the last thing is that the system greatly reduces the risk of unanticipated allowance price changes and price volatility by employing an effective price collar.
The European Union Emissions Trading System, EU ETS, started in 2005, is the largest carbon pricing regime in the world. It's a cap-and-trade system of CO2 allowances. The EU ETS covers almost half of the European Union's CO2 emissions in 31 countries, covering around 11,500 regulated emitters, of which mostly included electricity generators and large industrial sources, but did not include sources in transportation, commercial, or residential sectors. However, some regulations towards aviation sector emissions were added later on in 2012. Caps and allowances were initially decentralized, meaning each member state proposed their own carbon cap and allowances, then reviewed by the European Commission, which resulted in countries being very generous with their allowances of CO2 emissions. The EU ETS was designed to be implemented in phases. Phase 1 was from 2005 to 2007. Penalties for violations was €40 per ton of CO2, and the system allowed CO2 trading only. From 2008 to 2012 was Phase 2. The penalty increased from 40 to €100 per ton of CO2 emissions, and during this phase, the system allowed trading of other greenhouse gases as well. In Phase 3, which was from 2013 to 2020, the aim for determined cap was 20% under the emission levels in 1990, given a large share of allowances to be auctioned and unlimited banking of allowances between Phase 2 and 3. The performance of this system had many concerns. From the beginning of 2005 to early 2006, which was the beginning of Phase 1, the allowance price increased from €8 per ton of CO2 to €30. The generous allocation of allowances exceeded emissions by about 4%, causing the price to fall by 50% in just 1 week, later returning to €8 in mid-2006, then finally collapsing to zero at the end of Phase 1, which was in 2007. This volatility was due to several causes: a lack of good emissions data at the start of the program, too much excess in allowances, volatile energy prices, and inability to bank allowances from Phase 1 to Phase 2. The system's cap was tightened for Phase 2, and the allowance prices increased over €20 in 2008, then fell when a recession hit. By the beginning of 2013, member states were required to auction large shares of their allowances due to complaints from the initial free distribution of allowances. The main concern for the system was the low allowance prices and the lack of price floor. Without the binding of a price floor, the EU policies such as renewable generation and energy efficiency standards will raise costs and reduce allowance prices without reducing total emissions. So what can we take away from the European Union emissions trading system? First, good data are crucial in the allowance allocation and cap setting decisions. Second, banking is necessary when transitioning from one period to the next. The system didn't allow banking from Phase 1 to Phase 2, which resulted in the allowance price to fall to zero towards the end of the period. Third, European Union emissions trading system illustrates the outcome of the so-called complementary policies, particularly when put in place without a price floor. This will result in an increase in aggregated abatement costs and depressed allowance prices. Fourth, granting of free allowances should be linked to production. Otherwise, free allocation do not affect marginal costs and therefore does not provide incentives to increase output or relocate production in other jurisdictions. Fifth, however, the history of EU ETS shows the possibility of transitioning from free allowances to auction allowances over time. Other cap-and-trade systems were also briefly mentioned. Under the 1987 Montreal Protocol, some countries have implemented tradable rights system for ozone-depleting substances during ozone-depleting substances phase-down from 1991 to 2000. An international CO2 cap-and-trade system has also operated since 2008 under the Kyoto Protocol. In Annex 1 countries that have signed the Kyoto Protocol can sell their extra emissions reductions of their compliance to other Annex 1 countries within the compliance obligations. However, this type of trade is minimal since it's between nations rather than firms. Currently, CO2 cap-and-trade systems have been adopted and implemented in the development of countries all around the world, including Japan, South Korea, Kazakhstan, Switzerland, and China. Notably, Ontario's government recently announced a CO2 cap-and-trade system that links to Quebec's system and therefore to California's. So some lessons concluded from the system design perspectives are that cap-and-trade systems have proven to be more environmentally effective and economically cost-effective compared to the traditional command and control approaches. Cap-and-trade has proven to induce process of innovations as well as development in technological change. Also, a robust market requires a cap that is significantly below BAU emissions, and establishing accurate data before starting the first period of a program can avoid unnecessary price volatility. The banking of allowances have proven to be very important and can prevent price spikes and price collapses. And lastly, price collar acts to induce the risk of unanticipated allowance price changes by combining auction price floor with an allowance reserve. The cap-and-trade model has been applying in the policymaking process for 30 years. Although regions, nations or subnational jurisdiction are developing their own pollution regulation systems that is based on the cap-and-trade model. The author of this research paper still considers all these systems as early experiments, which would provide guidance of the application difficulty under various conditions. Some of these challenges have already been answered by researchers in theory. However, there are more to be solved. The following table is a summary of the major cap-and-trade experiences mentioned so far. As we can see from the last column, every time we try a different approach to improve the system, new problems will appear. However, setbacks don't discourage people from believing the cap-and-trade model is a potential solution to reduce emission problems and continue perfecting their market-based environmental policy systems.
As we implement cap-and-trade system in recent years, we found out that there are many flaws within its design. So first, it does not encourage some industry to change their behavior. For bigger firms, it's harder for them to switch to another method of production or implement pollution control, as it will cost much more when compared to smaller firms. With such a system implemented, they can now continue to produce the old-fashioned way without any improvement, and therefore keep polluting. Second, it's easier said than done when it comes to monitoring the actual pollution of each firm. Therefore, there's an incentive for them to cheat. Third, in today's system, there usually exists an additional room underneath the cap required by the system. Some heavy polluters continue getting extension for this additional room of pollution, which makes this system kind of useless. From the paper, we saw that there are many benefits gained from using cap-and-trade, but does it fit under every scenario? How can we improve it? In the article, author discussed that high volatility can harm the cap-and-trade system. The price collapse and price surge will make the market unstable, and the firms within the market will cease to trust the cap-and-trade system. Therefore, the author thinks that the government should take a more active approach to the system, decrease price volatility, and create a more stable market environment. However, we can see from economic history, sometimes government regulation will lead to more chaos. So do you think the government should get involved in terms of regulating the volatility in the cap-and-trade model, or take a more passive approach by letting the market decide its own price based on the supply and demand, the concept of the invisible hand by Adam Smith? And thank you guys for watching this week's presentation.